Okay. Um, all right, let me pull up my PowerPoint here. All right. Everybody, can everybody see the PowerPoint okay? Awesome. Great. Okay, so we are covering chapters 9 and 10 tonight. They go very well together because there are some similarities between political parties and interest groups. But before we get into that, just a fun little announcement that you have exam number 2 next week. All right. So hopefully you're following along with your schedule and the syllabus, and everything's on target. If you have any issues with assignments or anything like that, just reach out. I think everybody that's had a glitch or anything like that with their running into problems on their assignments, you've reached out. But if anything comes up, please let me know. Exam 2 is going to be the same format as exam 1, all multiple choice. You will log in through you will log into Blackboard, take the exam, roughly the same number of questions. You'll have the 90 minutes to complete all in one sitting, but you'll have the window will be from 7 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. So anytime you want to sit down in that window and take the exam, you're all good to go. You just have to complete the exam in one sitting, and then it will auto submit at 11:59. So just make sure you give yourself the full 90 minutes, right? I think everybody was okay on this, but right, if you log in at 11:58, you don't get the 90 minutes, right? You get a minute to complete the exam. So it automatically submits at 11:59. So find time to give yourself the full 90 minutes. Okay. Any questions about the exam? Just take into account that the points have doubled for exams 2 and 3, so you're at 200 points. So with roughly the same number of questions, you're going to have every question is worth twice as much, but that's okay. Everyone did well. I'm not worried about that. And I still have to award. There's going to be a curve on that first exam. I just haven't entered those numbers yet. All right. Any questions before we jump into political parties and interest groups? All right. Let me pull up my chat so I make sure I have that handy just in case. All right. Okay. So political parties. When we think of political parties, what do we mean? What are political parties? Like, we know we can identify them, but what's a definition of political parties? Can anybody give me an idea or tell me what you've read or what you think when you hear political parties? What do you think? Either in the chat or just verbally.
Distinct different groups of people that believe in ideally different things, and then they usually have candidates that believe in their sides, and then they compete for power over the government.
Beautiful, right? You have people that, right, you're creating these factions of people that are being grouped together based on a value system, right? So they have certain values, they believe certain things, right? And all of these things go into, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go through, a political party's platform. This is what we believe. These are the things we're gonna, if we are elected, these are the things we're gonna promote. These are the things we're gonna advocate for, and hopefully form public policy and implement that public policy. Some other important things Sebastian said is that they run candidates, right? The ultimate goal is to run candidates, seek power, right? Control government. So that really hits what we're talking about when it comes to political parties. So think about that when in regards to interest groups and how they are different, right? So we're talking about political activists. They organize to win elections, and they want to operate government to determine public policy. So Sebastian, great job. You hit it all, right? they tend to be as inclusive as possible. Why is that? Why do they want to be, like we talk about a certain value system, right? Like Sebastian talked about, they believe in the same things, but this seems kind of maybe it seems to go against that when you talk about inclusivity, right? Why do they want to be as inclusive as possible? So what benefits them from being more inclusive? What benefits a political party by if they're more inclusive? How do they benefit from that?
More support,
More support? What does that translate into?
higher chance at winning.
There you go, right? You want to win elections, right? Political parties want to win elections, right? So you try to be as inclusive as possible. Do sometimes political parties screw this up? Sure, they can. There's times throughout history where political parties have tried to, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of the political parties and and we can talk about where political parties are today. But think about this, right? The Republicans, you're looking at, 2000, 2010, 2012, 2014, where you have, and like I said, the Republican Party had more center right, more establishment, Republican members of Congress, and then you had the Tea Party, right? And they were at odds with each other, right? So you bring in this, you work to be as inclusive as possible, and there was agreement on a lot of different things, but maybe the correct public policy or how far to go the political or a public policy can sometimes cause problems. Do we see any of that today within our two major political parties? What do you think? Is there anything going on like that in the Republican Party today or within the Democratic Party? You have some more moderate. I mean, the Democrat Party is working through some of these issues now, right? Especially with their slim majorities in both in Congress, in both the House and the Senate, right? They have a more center left, some moderates, right? And then you have some that are kind of in that kind of middle category there, and then you have some, socialists, right? Progressives, right? Where they're pushing and pulling. So when you work to be inclusive, sometimes that can work in your favor, especially if you can find issues that people care about, right? We talk about populism, right? Tapping into the sentiments of the country at any particular time. We'll see that as we go through a brief history of political parties. But so that can work, in your favor. That can also work against you. So you have to be very careful about how far you kind of move that party platform or expand that party platform. Sometimes that can create division. So hopefully that makes sense, right? So I know we're going to talk about chapter 10 in a little bit, but it's good to point this out now. What's the difference between between political parties and interest groups? If you had to kind of take a shot at it, what's the difference between the two?
I don't think interest groups run candidates.
So that's a good point. So
Yeah.
and we'll talk about that, right? So and we'll talk about whether or not they run candidates, right? Because I think, but you're onto something here. But let's just take that point for granted right now. All right, I'll just take that comment in that your statement at face value. Let's say they don't run candidates. All right. So what aren't they seeking to do? If they don't run candidates, they're not trying to operate government, right? They're not trying to win enough seats to operate government. Okay. So very good point. That's really, they don't want to operate government. They want to have influence in public policy. They want to have influence in what the government does, but interest groups do not want to operate government. Now let's go back, right? So to something Sebastian said, they don't put forth candidates, right? Question mark. I put a question mark there, right? Because that used to be that interest groups didn't. They didn't put forth candidates, right? They would have a particular ideology. They would have an ideological bend. Of course, they would have public policy positions. They seem to be able to line up with one political party or or another. When there was less polarization between the two parties, they could get along with folks on both sides of the parties, depending on what the organization was or what they advocated for. But over time, maybe more so in this system of polarization, but I think it was happening even before then. We've had polarization going on for a long time. It's nothing new in the contemporary sense. But what interest groups have found is where they didn't used to run, they used to be true that they really didn't take an interest in running particular candidates, recruiting, fundraising for people within maybe their own ranks, or going out to find somebody that was a popular member of their organization to run for office, right? They didn't do that. They do that now, right? And we'll talk about that and how that potentially is wrapped up and tied to polarization. But interest groups started seeing a real possibility of getting groups or getting candidates that they favored, right? They were kind of getting, sometimes they were getting candidates, or it's happening more often that they were getting candidates that, right, where they would be, it's not that they wouldn't listen to the particular interest group, but that particular candidate or that representative was, right, dealing with a lot of different interest groups. And interest groups decided that, you know what, we want a candidate that's going to cater to us. And how do we do that? Well, we have to start recruiting and fundraising our own candidates and getting involved in the primary process. So it's not that they figured out that if they can get involved in the primary process, they can have more success and more influence in government moving forward. So your point's well taken, Sebastian. That's evolved over time, and interest groups are doing that more and more, working to influence the system by running candidates and getting involved early in the primary process. Right? So what do political parties do? Okay, they recruit candidates. Right now we see interest groups doing that, but let's focus on political parties. They do this. This is what their jobs are. Right? We see the RNC, the DNC, the RNCC, right? The SC, right? The DNCC, right? The Democratic National Congressional Committee, right? So you have all of these different committees, right? Their goal is to raise funds, to seek out candidates, find the best candidates that can be competitive, right? Especially based on the districts in which they want to win, right? So they're seeking out, where can we be competitive, right? The Democrats right now are in a defensive position, right? Going into the 2022 elections. They are looking for places where they could potentially pick up where they lost ground in 2020. But the Republicans are kind of on a feeding frenzy, right? Identifying candidates based on recent votes that they've taken that may live in more moderate districts, things like that, where they see potential pickups. So a lot that's going on, right? This doesn't happen. That's just not a random occurrence, right? They're constantly, these committees are constantly working to recruit and train and run candidates, right? They organize, they run elections, and by organizing and running elections, right? It's the pageantry of campaigns and getting involved in grassroots efforts and supporting candidates in a variety of different ways. But they're involved in making sure these candidates get over the finish line, right? We want, right? If we're going to support a candidate, we're going to recruit and help them fundraise. Of course, we want them to get over the finish line, right? They present alternative policies to the electorate. Okay, so they're saying, right, that we're seeing that now, right? We have, especially messaging can be very effective. We're talking about divided government and unified government. In Washington right now, do we have unified or divided government? Can anybody tell me? And what makes government unified or divided? And like I said, feel free to speak up or to put it in the chat. What do you think? What makes government unified or divided? Divided, right? You say divided, okay? Is it divided? Like, what do you mean? So when you hear divided, what do you think? And why do you say divided? Because I think I might know where you're going. Anybody else? Why, Sebastian said divided. Why does that seem to be accurate, right? When we hear divided, what are we thinking about? Let me help you out. I don't know if you're typing, Sebastian, but politically speaking, the pushing and pulling of laws, rules put in by each party, right? So when you hear divided, you're thinking, okay, the parties are pushing and pulling on each other. So that's where I thought you were going, right? There's these two political parties are competing. But what we mean by unified and divided government is who controls the levers of power, right? So we're talking from an institutional perspective, what political party controls the institutions. So if you look at Congress, both chambers, right, and like I said, on slim margins, but also the White House are controlled by the same political party. So we call that unified government, okay? So when another party, let's say, because I don't know if it's a safe bet, but chances are based on just historical outcomes that the Republicans will win one or both chambers of Congress in 2022. Just historically, there tends to be a swing and there's thin margins on the Democrat side anyway. We'll see if that happens. Well, if the Republicans manage to win one house or the other, right, then we'll have divided government. So we're talking from an institutional perspective. So, right, and the reason I ask these questions is to get us to think through so we understand, right? Because we see divided, right? We think politically, we think on a public policy perspective. And I just want to clarify that when we think of unified or divided government, we're talking about institutions that either political party controls, okay? So right now, and I raise this issue because right now, the Republican Party is focused on a campaign, and they'll carry that campaign through 2022 on this is what we'll do differently. And they can point at the unified government that the Democrats are running and saying, do you like this? Do you like this? Do you like this? If you don't, here's what we stand for. That gets a little bit tougher in divided government, right? If you have Joe Biden in 2022 will still be president, okay? And let's say the Republicans win the House and or the Senate, right? So that becomes a little bit murkier when you're trying to offer alternative policies because people, find it more difficult to know who to blame in divided government. Okay? And then political parties accept responsibility for operating government, right? The benefits and the drawbacks. So what are they're able to move forward with public policy, assuming, right, it's their public policy preferences are favorable, but they also have to take responsibility for the pitfalls as well. Right? And then, of course, this runs along with presenting alternative policies, but you act as the organized opposition to the party in power, right? So whatever party's in power, you're the opposition party, right? So you're working against whatever the other party in power is doing. All right, so I don't know how comfortable anybody feels talking about this. These are some questions to talk about. How do you feel about political parties, right? The Constitution and our rules for democracy don't, if you read the Constitution, right, there's no formal place for political parties. However, scholars argue that democracy would be unimaginable, right, without political parties. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about this question here. But how do you feel about political parties? Are they useful? Are they not useful? In which way are they useful or not? Can we do better? How could we do better? How can government function without political parties? What do you think? Anybody? No wrong answers here.
They seem pretty inevitable.
Why do you say that?
Like even if we didn't have a label,
Mhm.
even if we didn't have the Democratic or Republican Party, there's always going to be different opinions regardless of who you are. So even if
And
we
then what
didn't
happens?
have a
Good.
label, like even if
Good.
we didn't have a label for them, then there would always be a difference in opinion. Then there will always be people voting in either direction. So even if we didn't have them, they would still kind of subliminally be there. You know what I mean?
I do, absolutely. And that's what the scholars are talking about, right? Because of these issues. Issues come about, right? Whatever they're prime somehow, they become an issue, they get on the legislative agenda, they're being discussed. So they're placed on the national agenda or maybe at a state level. They're on a state agenda and they become an issue that people learn more about, they care more about. And then, like Sebastian said, what happens? You have this side and this side, right? People start to take sides. Not to mention that doesn't mean that there's not gray area and people in between and all that good stuff, right? But in general, there's binary choices, right? We support this or we oppose it, right? We go about it this way or we go about it that way. So you have a lot of these decisions, these choices are binary. So what happens, even without the party label, as Sebastian was saying, people would find each other, right? Especially within these legislative bodies, they find each other. Oh, they start to take notice. Who are my allies, right? Who's my opposition, right? I care about this. Who opposes me, right? Who supports me? And they start to seek each other out, right? And then they start to, and we'll talk about this when we get to Congress, they start to log roll. They start to do, right? Hey, we agree on a lot of this stuff. Vote for my legislation. I'll vote for yours. And we work together. And then more people take notice and they come together, right? So that's what scholars are talking about. And Sebastian stated that very well is, right, even without the label, it's going to happen. Now, the political parties, they put a label to it, right? So you don't have to start from scratch on every issue, right? You can kind of pull together based on that party loyalty and that party label. You can work on a variety of issues all at once instead of starting, okay, I got to identify my support with this issue or that issue and start kind of running the tally of and whipping votes, right? The political party does that, right? Because as Sebastian said, it's inevitable because people are going to sort that way based on where they fall on an issue. Um, any thoughts about um, how, without political parties, let's say um, this sorting didn't take place through political parties. Um, how is there another way to go about completing this function without political parties? And that's a tough one because it's hard to envision, right? People just not sorting and then and saying, okay, look, this is what our party platform is going to be. This is what we're going to support and working together, right? And there's comfort in that and there's productivity in that because, right, they can come together and you're talking about 435 members of the House trying to organize any other way. There's not a lot that could get done, right? And some might argue that that's a good thing, right? You wouldn't be able to process as much legislation or not. But when there's something pressing, right, of national importance, maybe national security, something like that, right, not being able to pull together immediately and organize from a party perspective, that becomes difficult. But good thoughts. Very good job. All right. Okay. So I'm going to tell you, we're going to run through kind of a brief history of political parties in this country. All right. Don't worry about this history for the exam, right? I'm not going to ask you questions about, tell me about, right? Like, what were the issues of the first party system, right? I'm not going to say, hey, which of these A, B, C, or D was an issue that brought about, the political parties in the first party system. I'm not going to do that. The reason I go through this history is because when we talk about the parts of the political party in just a minute here, I want you to understand how the political parties have evolved. Okay. And what makes, if you had to take a guess, or maybe you know the answer, what makes a political party come about or evolve? What are the things that make that happen? And it's based on something Sebastian said just a little bit ago. Why do parties come about? Why do they evolve? What do you think?
Opinions.
Opinions, right? Issues come about, right? And people take sides. And political parties, that people come together and they form political parties and they recognize the issues that are important to people. And when they recognize issues that are important to people, what do they try to do? They try to get their hands around it and incorporate it into their political platforms in one way. And they try to say, okay, how can we incorporate this into our overall party platform? How does it fit our ideology? What position can we take? But they're trying to encompass and include that in the party platform because it's important to people. Okay, so that's what I want you to focus on, is the fact that, okay, what's going on in the country that, you know, would cause this political party to form, or this political party to get stronger, or people to shift loyalties and go with another political party, right? That's what I want you to see, because it provides an illustration of, right, when we talk about the different parts of the political party, it makes a lot of sense. But don't worry about, like I said, this isn't a history class. I want you to understand terms and concepts, you know, from a political science perspective, not a, history is important. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. History can help us paint a picture and put some things into context in our understanding in the world of political science. So the first party system, we had the development of the parties, right? 1789 to 1828, right? It's where dominating, you know, we have two parties dominating, right? And we're talking a two-party system where you have basically one side of an issue or another. Both sides have a reasonable chance of winning, right? You're not just going to have blowouts, right? Because a blowout on one side, right, it's not really a two-party system. It's just kind of a, right, what we consider a third party today. It's just a kind of a party that's out there but not being successful. Okay. All right. So you have the Federalists, right, and the Anti-Federalists, right? What's going on at that time, right? So you're talking about the ratification of the Constitution and how that's played out, right? But that was the initial issue of the day. Saying, okay, how strong should the central government be, right? How much power should the states be able to retain, right? How much power should they be able to reserve? Okay, so that was this battle of how this government was going to work, right? And people created these factions, essentially the initial political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And what happened? They were not just talking about the Federalists, a strong national government, but you start to see kind of this snowball, slow snowball, but this snowball, okay, they're picking up on this commercial interests, right? The Federalists were picking up on saying, okay, look, these commercial interests are something we're seeing some similarities between people that want a strong national government and the commercial interests. So we're picking up on some of those things. The Anti-Federalists, talking about Thomas Jefferson in 1800, the Republicans, not the Republicans of today, right, but the Democratic Republicans, you know, and we have these artisans and farmers, right? So different groups of people looking at different things, and we can kind of see, right, the artisans, the farmers, right, why they were skeptical of a strong central government. They start to find a home with the Anti-Federalists, right? So you see, right, people are sorting based on the issues of the day. Okay, so then you had the era of good feelings, okay, with the Republicans from 1800, 1825, where Republicans were regularly elected, okay? In the years from 1817 to 1825, when Monroe was president, there's in fact like essentially no political opposition. And when people really don't have concerns about what's going on, they're happy, right? They have good feelings about what's going on in the country and how things are shaking out. And in the public policy that's being implemented, right? There's kind of that feeling, well, we don't really need to change what we're doing here, okay? Um, they opposed the call for stronger central government, were proactive in acquiring territories, establishing the national bank. They weren't really doing anything that was controversial. People were happy, right? So what comes out of this, right? And the era of personal politics. Why would the era of personal politics come out of this era of good feelings? Why do you think that would be? Well, why, we have this era of good feelings, but then it becomes the era of personal politics. How does that work? So I don't know if you've ever watched a debate or especially in a primary election, you might have a number of different candidates and they agree on a lot of different things, right? Within a political party, and you're in a debate and someone says, well, this is how I'd go about it. And the other candidates say, yeah, me too. That makes sense. I agree with that too. Right. Um, well, who's the standout there, right? Maybe the incumbent is making the case, or maybe there's no incumbent, but the person that's making the statements, right, or putting out all these other things is the one kind of that front runner that's making the case, and all these other individuals are just saying, yeah, me too, me too, me too. Okay, and ultimately, right, if people agree on a lot of different things, and you can't differentiate yourself on public policy, what do? You shift to their character. Okay, so you see a lot of that. If I can't offer an alternative in public policy because what's going on is popular, okay, so I can't oppose that, but I generally agree with what's going on, so I can't really go out and say, well, I agree with everything that Joe Smith is doing, but I want to beat him in the upcoming election. Right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So what do? You go to the personal level and say, okay, well, yeah, things are going well, but we can do better because Joe's corrupt or whatever the case might be. So when you can't, we see that happen when you're in primaries, especially. Of course, it happens in general elections, but we see that a lot in primary elections. It turns that way because there's not a lot of policy disagreement. All right, so then we have the second party system. We have the Democrats and the Whigs, 1828 to 1860. Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson, one of the two major political parties evolving out of the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. It was engaged in populism, right? We hear that word populism a lot these days. The common man, right, which typically meant the white man at that time, involved in it. The party involved common citizens in the process, right? That's what populism is, right? Getting people involved in the process. What are your concerns? Trying to tap in to the issues of the day. What are the common man concerned about? Okay. The Whig Party, the National Republicans, talking about John Adams, the major party in the United States during the first half of the 19th century, formally established in 1836. It was an anti-Jackson party and represented a variety of regional interests, right? So opposing what Jackson is doing, looking at different issues. What can we look at? What issues can we raise to oppose him? Well, let's look at improvements in infrastructure, right? So internal improvements and building infrastructure, improving infrastructure, that was important, right? And then there was a small number of free blacks that identified as Whigs because of some of the positions of the Democrat Party under Andrew Jackson. Okay. All right. Both parties appealed to popular enthusiasm and themes. Okay. And this is where you start to get this evolution of what these political parties would do. How do they try to tap into that? How do they reach out to people? How do they try to include people in what they're doing? How do they get support, right? Their goal, as we said earlier, is to win elections. How do they do that? They have to get more votes. They have to get people involved. So this mass campaigning starts to come about, and it's evolved ever since, right? Rallies, parades, right? Getting people excited, getting them enthused, trying to build that party loyalty was all very important, right? So you're trying to, and we see that, right? How often do we see somebody, does anybody, let me ask you this, does anybody know anybody who's been a Republican or a Democrat for forever and a day, and you're trying to figure out, well, but maybe the things that are the issues of the day, they don't necessarily line up with that political party, but they never switch. I know a bunch of people like that. I look at them, I'm like, this does not make any sense. The issues that that are on the priority list for a political party, you don't agree with any of them. Well, I've been a Democrat for forever. I've been a Republican for forever, right? That's building that enthusiasm, that party identity can be very, very powerful thing moving forward, right? All right, the third party system, Republicans rise to power, and the Civil War. Right now, we're getting into the modern Republican Party, okay, in which the Northern and the Southern Whigs split. Okay, the modern Republican Party emerged in the 1850s as an anti-slavery party and consisted of Northern Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats. Right. So what's going on in this with the Republican Party, right? The modern Republican Party at this time, right? What's the issue, right? Slavery is a prominent issue. So party coming together, right? There was a division within the Whig Party on the issue. So you have anti-slavery Democrats going with the Northern Whigs, right? And then you have the Democrats in the South, the Southern Whigs, right? That would form the modern Democrat Party, right? So you see the issues evolve, what issues are important of the day, and the parties, right, gravitate to those, right? Or new parties form based on that issue, right? They continue to evolve. The Democratic Party and the Southern, the Southern Whigs. There was resentment following the Civil War, fear that a central government would intervene on behalf of African Americans, and the party dominated the white South for a century. Right, so that was a very important issue, right, up through the 1960s, and became critical, right? Those states, right, and then they those states started to change party affiliation, right, through into the 1970s and things like that, based on a variety of economic interests. But that's a conversation for a different day, right? So what ended up happening during this period of the third party system, of the third kind of two-party system, right? This era, right? Republicans promoted business and economic growth, but they were, imposing evangelical Protestant values, such as the prohibition of alcohol, right? So what they were promoting, and Democrats said, wait, we're opposed to coercive measures by government. Catholics were strongly Democratic, right? Because they saw that evangelical Protestants were affiliating with the Republicans, and Catholics said, no, we oppose these things, so we're Democrats, right? So we see religious divides, we see these different beliefs, the different values becoming issues, continuing to become issues for the political parties. Right? The ultimate triumph of the Republicans was the fact that the Democrats embraced they made a mistake, right? Which we see happen, right? Republicans have done this, Democrats have done this, political parties have done this. You make a calculation, right? Democrats embrace this populism where they champion the interests of small farmers who were deep in debt, right? They thought this was a winning issue, right? They put it at a priority on their party platform. They supported inflation, which reduced the real value of debt, right? So inflation, right, is about the value of currency, right? So that impacts the value of debt, right? So so you have this issue where they're saying, like, this could be a really a winning issue for us. They misstepped, okay? And then urban working class voters feared inflations would reduce their purchasing power and became Republican. So you have these competing interests. And right, why were the Republicans? Why did they triumph? Because there's more people, more urban class working people than farmers, right? And so the sure numbers were, helped the Republicans win more elections. So hopefully you get an idea of how this evolution, right? All right, then the fifth party system coming out of right the New Deal, and then you have Democrat dominance, right? 1932 to 1968, right? What did FDR do, right? What was FDR's response when he was president to the Great Depression, right? So the growth of the national government, creating social welfare programs, job programs, a variety of different programs to help Americans get through the Great Depression. And so, based on economics, you saw African Americans shift from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party based on right. We need to support the Democratic Party because they are supporting us with these programs to help us get through the Great Depression. So you had this weird, right? This really weird dynamic of Southern whites at the time, right? And African Americans, right, were at odds on substantial issues regarding right slavery and race relations. Now in the same party based on a externality, right? The Great Depression, the collapse of the economic system, coming together to support a political party that was advancing these ideas and these plans, these programs to help Americans survive and get through the Great Depression. So, right. So another example of just evolution based on what's going on at the given time. All right. So the post-party era, 1968 to the present, right? We typically see this as red state, blue state, right? We hear that all the time. It's more complicated than that. We see red state, blue state, and that dominates because everyone pays attention to the presidential election, and all but two states are winner take all when it comes to the electoral college tally. So we think of, oh, who won this state? Who won that state? But again, when you look at congressional districts, when you look at urban centers, even within, like I said, you look at state I'm in, Tennessee, right? So you have Tennessee, right? It's red, right? It's red comes out for the Republican presidential candidate, right? Don't see that changing anytime soon, but there are specks of purple throughout the state, right? In the urban centers around Nashville, Chattanooga, Knoxville, Memphis. So there are places where there are, right? It's not all red, right? It's not all conservative, right? There's more moderates, there's liberals, and so far there's progressives too. So, but that's how we see the party system. That's probably the most common representation of the parties, right? Some trends, right? And actually in some of these in 2016 and 2020, they were changing, right? The Democratic Party, right? You see African American voters, women, lower income voters, union voters, Latino voters. GOP, you typically talk about better educated voters, more formal education, higher income voters, older voters, white men, evangelical voters. That's starting to change, and even in some of that in 2016, but definitely in 2020 that changed. You see Republicans getting talk about the presidential candidates, Donald Trump getting a larger percentage than expected of the Latino vote, the African American vote, lower income vote. Democrats were getting more individuals with more formal education, higher income voters. So we're going to see if those trends start to kind of reverse themselves and then hold. I think it'll depend on the issues moving forward, but we're starting to see some signs that, and it could be based on the candidates at the time or could be, fluke election, but we'll see how the parties try to capitalize on certain issues. All right. So, like I said, take that the history of the parties for what it's worth as an illustration of what political parties try to accomplish, right? Try to identify issues, or they sort based on issues of the day, and they work to, advocate for a particular public policy decision and recruit people to their party and win as many votes as they can and control government. But a lot of times we talk about third parties, and we'll talk about third parties here as well. But in this country, third parties don't do well. And we'll talk about some of those reasons, but it's important to talk about the historical foundations of the two-party system. I think Sebastian did mention this. Why are there two-party systems, right? The dualist nature of conflict, right, is, right, there's this side, that side, right? Support, oppose, right? It's an oversimplification, but in general, conflicts are dual. There's a dual nature of them, right? There's one side or the other. And that's typically why the two-party system has endured, right? And then you throw in their party loyalty and the strength of the political parties over time, that matters, right? But political socialization plays a role, as I talked about, party loyalty, right? Children learn party identification early. My kids know my political party affiliation. My kids know my wife's political party affiliation, and my kids are soon to be 9, soon to be 7, and maybe not the 4-year-old, but the older two definitely do. They know, right? They ask questions, they're intuitive. Kids are smart, right? They hear things, right? And of course, I watch the news or talk about politics, right? My kids hear it, but they learn, right? They put 2 and 2 together. Oh, who are you supporting? You're supporting Donald Trump? Oh, you're a Republican. Oh, you're supporting Joe Biden. You're a Democrat, right? So they're very smart. Kids put things together, and you learn that over time, and that sticks with you. Okay. Political parties are viewed as a realistic way to power, right? And you learn that third parties aren't very successful. So if you want to garner power, if you want your public policy to be supported and advanced, you tend to go with one of the 2 major parties. Right? So some other reasons the two-party system has endured. Well, we have a winner-take-all electoral system in this country. Okay? So when we talk about, right, there's no benefit to second place. Okay, so they're based on a plurality, right? Even if you're running against 2, 3, 4, 5 people, it doesn't matter, right? Winner takes all, and it's a plurality system, which means you don't have to get a majority of the vote. You have to get the most votes, and that's what a plurality system is. You just have to get whoever gets the greatest number of votes than any other candidate wins. Doesn't have to be a majority. And then the electoral college, we see that it's winner take all, except for Maine and Nebraska. They have a district system, but it's winner take all within those districts, right? Or within the whole state, however they calculate that out. But within each state in the presidential election, it's winner take all. It could be it could be, 0.1% difference. It doesn't matter that you get all the votes. Okay, you get all the votes in that particular state. But in any election, right? You just one vote ahead. That's it. You win. Okay. And then state and federal laws favor the two political parties, if you can imagine that, right? So I think I might have mentioned this here. Can't remember if it's here in another class, right? There's rules to ballot access, right? We talked about voting in elections, right? Who decides to run? Candidates decide to run, parties recruit, but people have to get on the ballot. They have to access the ballot. They do that by getting petitions. They have to get signatures. They have to collect those. They have to go out and do that. Well, a lot of times you have disadvantages for third parties or independents. You have to get more signatures than an established party. So who's making these rules? Members of the political parties who have been elected to office. So there's a kind of I don't know, I wouldn't go so far as to say corrupt system, but it definitely disadvantages those who aren't within the system, right? So you're using the institutions of government to your advantage. All right. So we talk about the role of, but people run under third party labels. Why do they do that? If they're not going to win, or the chances of them winning are slim to none, why do they do that? Well, they can influence the major parties. Okay, so they can have an impact, right? Think about this. The two major parties want to have as much influence as they can. They try to have cast a wide net, big tents, right? All of those different analogies. All right. So they do this, but if they see a third party gaining in popularity because of the issues that they're talking about, the positions that they take, one or both of the political parties could work to get a piece of that support. So if you can find a third party that's hitting on an important issue and really generating a lot of support, right? Ron Paul, right? Of all people, Ron Paul with young libertarians did this, right? And he was able to, right, between support, right? The Republicans wanted younger people involved, but they couldn't find a way to do that. But because of some of the positions Ron Paul was taking in the Libertarian Party and that movement, right, he was able to get a lot of young libertarian support that was coveted by the Republican Party. So he had some chits, right? He could negotiate some things, right? Which makes him and those supporters players in the system. So we saw this, even though, let's say, Bernie Sanders ran, especially in 2016, even though he was running not as a third party, we saw that he was doing well within the Democratic primary, right? He didn't ultimately win, but because he garnered so much support, he was able to negotiate with Hillary Clinton when it came to positions she ultimately was taking in the general election publicly, right? Stuff that Sanders and his supporters wanted to hear out of the Democratic candidate's mouth, he was negotiating, right, to have those positions front and center. So you can get my point, right? So there's an opportunity for third parties to push a particular agenda, right, a particular position, and hopefully it gets picked up by one of the other two major parties. But they can also affect the outcome of an election, right? They can be what we call spoilers. Saw that with Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Ross Perot in the 1992 election. So they can do that too. So people think, well, isn't third parties good, right? And we can argue yes, no, maybe so, right? What does more political parties do for us? I'm not opposed to them, but at the same time, right? Does it get more confusing for voters? Does it cost more for voters to do more research, right? There's pros and cons to both, but those are advocating for third parties and more third-party involvement, they talk about instituting majoritarian voting or proportional representation. Does anybody know what we talked about plurality voting? What's majoritarian voting? Anybody? I'm not trying to trick you here. Majoritarian voting. Anybody?
It's just a system in which whoever's running has to have a majority of the votes to be elected.
Right. Okay. So absolutely. So where you have to get a majority of the vote, right? Not plurality, not the most votes, a majority. So let's say there's, 4 candidates running and there's 500 people, the 500 people voted, right? You have to get 251 votes, right, to win, right? Doesn't matter if you got, right, 200 and everyone and the other 4 candidates got less than 200, doesn't matter. Okay. And what a majoritarian voting system means, and in some places, especially in primary elections, we have systems like this in a variety of states, right? Where you have, right, runoff elections. Okay. So you have, we just saw this in, Georgia, right? In the US Senate campaigns, right? Where, kind of these runoff elections, if you didn't get a majority, right, you have to run again in a subsequent election, right? So so the idea is for third parties in that case where now there's a benefit of running and more third parties running, because why? If what would be the advantage of a third party running in a majoritarian system, majoritarian voting system? Why do scholars think that more third parties would get involved in elections if there was majoritarian vote? I know I'm asking you a lot of questions tonight. What's the benefit? What would be the benefit to third parties in a system like this? What are third parties trying to accomplish? They want to win just like anybody else. So it's not about winner take all anymore, right? All I have to do is prevent, right? I might not get the most votes, but if I can work hard and I can find an issue that resonates with people and prevent the lead vote getter from getting 50%, then there's a benefit to me coming in second place.
They're
'Cause
not trying to
now-
win.
Go ahead, say that again.
Yeah, they're not trying to win. They're just trying to take away from whoever they're against.
Right. And if they can do that successfully, what happens? Maybe the person, somebody in the major party, and then if you can come in second, you can clear the field and get into a runoff election. Right? So that's where the benefit comes in. If a plurality doesn't win, right, you're not necessarily interested. Now, if you got the majority, that'd be great. If you got the plurality, that would be great. Okay, but the goal there's a benefit to coming in second place, because then you would push into if nobody got a majority, you could push a candidate into a runoff election, and then voters could focus on the two new candidates in this runoff election. So that's what individuals have advocated for as far as a more majoritarian system. And we've seen that play out in runoff elections. We've seen that play out. There's others too, but let's say I'm familiar with the mayoral races in Chicago. You have to if you don't get 50%, the top 2 vote getters run, right? And so that's why you see, and you'll see a bunch of candidates jump in the race to see if there's any chance that they can, even if there's 10 people in the race, they might dip their toe in the pool to see if there's a chance that they could come in second place, even if there's an incumbent or a popular candidate. If they could come in second place, then all of a sudden they can clear the field and run head to head with somebody, and that improves their chances of winning. And then folks talk about a proportional system of representation. What does that mean? What's a proportional system of representation? Anybody want to take a shot at that? See these a lot in countries with parliament, with a parliamentary system. So proportional, when you think proportional, right, you think, right, I get a proportion of whatever, let's say I've earned or I've worked for or I've completed, right? Let's say in this class, if you did, if you did 70% of the work, but you didn't finish XYZ, I would give you partial credit, right? You would get credit for the things that you accomplished, right? So it's proportional. So in a system of government, you're talking about seats, right? Elected seats of power being given on a proportional basis. Okay, so okay, the Democratic Party got 30% of the vote. They get 30% of the seats. Okay, the Republican Party got 30% of the vote. They get 30% of the seats. All right, and then the last 40% are, okay, you got the Green Party, they maybe got 10, 15%, and the Libertarian Party and this party and that party, and all of a sudden they got, and even this party way down here got 5%, but they get 5% of the seats. All right, so there's a benefit to not just coming in first or second, but third, fourth, fifth, sixth, right? Because no matter what, if you can hit a certain threshold, right, you can get a certain number of seats within that government, right? And individuals have advocated for that, because then third parties would not only be able to win elections, but have a seat at the table. And again, within a system of government, like a parliamentary system, we see, we talk about parties having to form a government, right? They have to get together. You have different factions, different political parties. After the elections, if they don't have a majority, they have to work with other minority parties or third parties to try to form a coalition government, right? And that brings other parties to the table, right? So they can start to advocate for the things that they want, right? Sorry if I'm getting a little too wonky, but that's right. That's where you get, it's important to understand why third parties don't do well in the United States, right? Because of the system, the electoral systems that we have. Okay? All right, so let's talk about now, let's tell a contemporary political party. In this contemporary area, what are the components of a political party, right? There's a party in the electorate. When we say party in the electorate, what do we mean? Who are the party in the electorate? I can't see any of you, but raise your hand, right? That's you, that's me, that's us, right? We're the party in the electorate, right? If you don't affiliate yourself with a political party, then okay, but you might from time to time based on an election, based on the issues, the things you're concerned about. But we're the party in the electorate, right? We affiliate ourselves with a political party. Typically, we're talking about more long-term party loyalty, but right, there can be short-term loyalties as well. But those members of the general public who identify with a political party or express a preference for one party over another, right? It could be over a long period of time or a particular shorter period of time based on the issues, like I said, right? But that's us, right? We're a substantial party, right? The political parties cannot hold power without us. That's important, right? And then we have this party organization, right? This is when we think of political parties, this is what we're familiar with, right? So we'll talk about those things, but we have the party organization and the party in government, in addition to the party in the electorate, okay? So you have the party organization. This is the formal structure and leadership of the political party, right? You have committees, local, state, and national executives, paid professional staff. These are the people that are doing the work of the political party, raising funds, identifying candidates, right? Working with different lobbying groups, interest groups, right? To uh, formalize support on a particular public policy issue, whatever the case might be. But they're working to do this, basically support the party organization. All right, you have the national convention, right? You have the national committees, the national convention. That's important during presidential elections, right? This is part of kind of the pageantry of elections, but there's also important work that goes on there, shaping the party platform, voting on the party platform. So you nominate your presidential and vice presidential candidate, you write the platform, you choose the national committee, and you conduct party business, right? Who's deciding these? Convention delegates, right? So convention delegates are what we see on our ballot in a presidential primary election. Those are the individuals that we see on the ballot, right? Those are the people we're really voting for, right? You see, vote for 3 for Joe Biden, vote for 3 for Donald Trump, right? Or whoever else is in the primary, vote for this candidate or that candidate. And those, whoever wins the most votes in that congressional district gets to send their delegates to the national convention, right? So it's people being elected locally as delegates that go to the convention and they vote on all of these things, the party platform, the members of the national committee, they're ones, right? You've ever seen from the floor of a convention, right? Each state gets together, okay? And they're voting on the delegation is voting on, the state delegation is voting for a candidate, right? So based on each state, right? Again, we know the party platform, what the party stands for, what their positions are. And I outline the principles of the party, okay? But usually a lot of, there's important principle, there are important public policy positions out there, right? And then, there's a lot of fluff too, right? About who cares the most about America and all that good stuff, right? There's politics obviously involved, but right, they're outlining important public policy positions, right? And it's interesting if you go through and look at the party platforms, and you can go out and search for these, and there's their archive. And you can see the parties evolving on issues over time. The national committee is a standing committee of national party of the national party, and they establish to direct and coordinate political activities between the national conventions. Then you have the state parties, right? These become very important during presidential elections and getting boots on the ground, right? Helping state candidates as well, state and local candidates, and holding state party conventions as well. These are very important at the state level. State organization becomes very important because of the unit rule, right? We've talked about this. All of a state's electoral votes are cast for the presidential candidate receiving the plurality of the vote in that state, outside of Maine and Nebraska, right? They have a different, they have a proportional system. And presidential candidates will focus on states that they can win, right? Or that are evenly divided, these battleground states. So the state organizations in those states can be very influential. All right. And you have local party organizations, right? These are things where you're right. When we talk about all politics are local, you're supporting members of county boards and state legislatures and members of Congress. They're involved in all of these things. And so local parties, it's different governing bodies have tried to clamp down on this over time, but it's still, especially in urban centers, can be a particular issue of patronage in some of these local organizations, providing jobs or work for individuals that support candidates or a particular party, right? Very significant in the 1800s, right? Not as prevalent today, but you still see that within larger cities and things like that. Right, and then you have the party in government, right? So you have the party in the electorate, the party organization, and the party in government. Who are these individuals? These are the individuals who are holding office within government, that are operating government. Okay, so they identify they identify as a member of a political party. They've won their election. They're in office, right? So these are the individuals that are creating public policy. Now we've talked a little bit about this already, right? The party and government, right? And things matter, right? The context of how public policy is being debated matters. Is it divided government? Is it unified government? Okay, so we've talked about what divided government is, right? Divided government can create headaches, right? For let's say one political party that might have the White House and one chamber of Congress, but can't get something through the other chamber, right? It can be very difficult. But there's also challenge. There's benefits to that as well. The being able to provide political cover. The opposing party being able to provide political cover. But unified government isn't always the answer either. A lot of times when a political party holds all the cards, so to speak, they have to be very careful about how they move forward. And if there's any dissension within the ranks, majorities can kind of fall apart or be weak depending on a particular issue. And they have to be careful because they're going to own the outcome of any public policy. So that there's pros and cons to both divided and unified government. We see this happening more and more where individuals will they'll split their ticket. Like I said, there's the party loyalists, but there's those there seems to be more folks, the more independents we talk about that are willing to split their tickets, vote for one party for one office, another party for another office. It's not a substantial number, but it ebbs and flows. It seems to be growing at the current time, right? There are some limits, right, based on where people fall in their positions within a particular party, especially within a big tent. There's limits of party unity based on that. But campaigns are candidate centered, right? You're running on the issue within a district, within a state. You're running on the personality of that particular candidate running. So they can be very focused on the candidates themselves. So when the candidates are running these candidate-centered elections, sometimes they have to distance themselves from the political party or the positions the party is taking, and so that can hurt the unity within the party. And then we look at our two-party system today. We talk a lot about party polarization and why that's come about, why the cleavages or the schisms between the two parties are so far. Well, it's like I said, it's who's being elected to office, the ideologies of the individuals that can sway and persuade individuals within that political party how far to move the political party one direction or another. But it's interesting, even with all the polarization, in this country, it's not a circumstance in which there's a lot of competition throughout the country. We talk about congressional seats, right? House seats. There's only 32 competitive districts in the whole United States, right? You can go and you can essentially count, right? There's most of the seats are, right? 403 seats are safe seats, right? Where the district returns the legislator with 55% or more of the vote, and it happens regularly. There's only 32 competitive seats, which means that's where the battle lines are drawn. Right now, that doesn't mean, given any particular circumstance in any election, there aren't more competitive seats, but it's holds pretty well at 32. But that 32, remember, that's a big swing, right? That 32 becomes 64, right? That can be a big swing, right? Because you double that. For every, if a party loses one seat and the other party picks it up, it's essentially a two vote swing. So that can be, those 32 seats can provide big changes within Congress. All right. So what do you think are some reasons for polarization? Anybody? Anybody ever heard of conditional party governments? Right? So people think that the political parties being strong, that's what causes polarization, right? And conditional party government means that when the parties are polarized, and the parties within themselves are homogenous, right? They kind of hold together well, right? Parties become more powerful, right? And that's a benefit to the party, right? So there's a benefit to the party of enhancing kind of that polarization. But so that's kind of one thought. Another thought is gerrymandering. Anybody think that gerrymandering can cause polarization? So that's kind of a common idea, right? Well, if you gerrymander and everybody gets, and then you start to have like more safe Republicans or safe Democratic seats, then the people that are elected is only going to be from one party, and they can become more extreme, and then the interest groups get involved in those primaries and push candidates to the right, and then right or left, and then right, they're gerrymandered so like the other side can't compete. And that makes a lot of sense until you consider the fact that the US Senate has become more polarized as well. And those seats don't get gerrymandered at all. So that kind of falls out pretty quickly, right? Partisan sorting, right? So you have this idea where, right, we're actually sorting better, right? We're what political party we affiliate with. So as we sort better and we go into we sort with one political party to the other, the political parties learn, okay, who's loyal to this party, who's loyal to that party, and based on those policy preferences, they just become more separated because we've essentially correctly separated to the right political party. So we've sorted ourselves properly, and that doesn't create a lot of work in the middle. You don't have as many moderate Republicans and Democrats because people saying, you know what, I don't really see myself on most issues with the Democrats anymore. I'm going to go Republican, or vice versa. So we're sorting ourselves better, and that allows the political parties to kind of give up that middle ground and become more polarized. Primary elections, and this is one where I tend to be. This is the kind of camp I tend to hang out in, because I've seen how interest groups have gotten very active in the primary process, and what that typically does is pull the public policy to further to one extreme or the other. So I think primary elections are a pretty good explanation, or at least in part, for polarization. Private campaign finance, where again interest groups, that nobody has to be beholden to the party. They can push out the ideologies, be involved in supporting candidates that are further to the right and left, creating additional polarization. Southern realignment, we talking about that in the 70s with the southern states realigning. You kind of look at that map, but that happened a lot. That happened over a long period of time. So it's hard to kind of make that case, because it did happen over a long period of time. But the last thing is that kind of this culture war, right? Are people, right? This goes along with primary elections and partisan sorting are people, is this culture war where people are really taking these issues and making them the centerpiece of how they vote and where they vote, and placing them and keeping them on the national agenda, right? The abortions, for instance, right? Are these culture war issues, are they creating the polarization where you're pushing the two extremes away from each other, and the parties are picking up on that and trying to garner that support? So just a variety of examples. It's good to understand the different potential explanations for polarization. All right, stop here. All right, let's see what time it is. It's 8. I'm sorry, it's 7:22. So I know there's a lot to cover in that chapter. That tends to be one of the longer one compared to the two. What we're going to cover in chapter 10 is not nearly that long. It's 7:23 now. Are you guys good? You want to take like a 7-minute break? And so at 7:30 we'll come back. We can cover chapter 10. I anticipate by 8 or maybe a few minutes after we'll be done with chapter 10. How does that sound? We got a thumbs up. Anybody else? That sound good? Or do you want to push through, or did I lose everybody? Anybody else? All right, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to pause. All right. Okay, just recording again. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. Like I said, there's a lot to cover in chapter 9. Chapter 10's quite a bit shorter. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Okay. Everybody see the screen? Perfect. Okay. All right. So chapter 10. So now we're going into these, like I said, these goes political parties and in the interest groups, they go hand in hand really well. We already talked a little bit about interest groups at the beginning of chapter 9, kind of comparing them to political parties. But interest groups are an organized group of individuals. They share common objectives, and they actively attempt to influence policymakers. Right? They do this during campaigns. They do this after campaigns. Right? So they want to support the candidates that are going to support them, help them get elected. But then that also after they get elected, they're working with those elected officials, those elected representatives, to get their preferred public policy passed, right? So that's typically what we see. How do they go about this? They do it with, some, professional staff, right? We typically think of lobbyists, right? These, it's a lobbyists. There can be firms, individuals, but they attempt to influence legislation and administrative decisions, right? So these lobbyists work not only with elected representatives, but also members of the bureaucracy. And we'll talk more about that when we get into that chapter. But right, so there's a lot of policy being made, being created not only in Congress and state legislatures, local governing bodies, but also within the bureaucracies, within the administrative agencies. So interest groups use lobbyists to influence that process as well. So you have, and we'll talk about it, but interest groups use, their members too, right? Man on the street, Main Street individuals to work to influence elected officials as well. So we have this idea of social movements, right? And social movements can come in many shapes and forms, right? We saw groups, social movements such as, kind of this push for 15, right? This push for $15 minimum wage. So these social movements can come about based on issues of the day, and they can, not all the time, but a lot of time interest groups form out of these social movements. So if there's a particular issue that people can start to kind of coalesce around and find support for, and they can have sustained support for that. And it's not just a one issue kind of get it done and then kind of it dissipates. If they can have sustained support for those positions or several different positions, that social movement has the potential to turn into a interest group. But right, but it start a lot of times these interest groups start as social movements. So why are there so many, right? If you think about it, there's just so many interest groups, and it's not just right interest groups trying to influence public policy. It's just groups of um, why people get together, to bird watch, to because they like to row. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons people come together, and we'll talk about those reasons. So just groups in general, there's so many. But when it comes to influencing government, why are there so many? Well, because our system was built that way, right? We have this right, this civil liberty, this freedom to peaceably assemble, right? We have the freedom to petition our government for a redress of grievances. Right? It's right there in our founding documents, right? It's something that's protected. It's coveted by other countries, right? This idea that you can come and right actively protest, engage your government is very important, right? It's a fundamental founding value of this country. In addition, our federal system, which we've talked about, where there's shared powers at different levels of government, there's pressure points, right? Where you can find support for your public policy or try to garner opposition to a particular public policy. But you have all these pressure points. You can do it at the local level, county, state, federal level. And since all of these individuals are elected locally, members of Congress, state legislatures, county commissioners, mayors, city council members, right? Statewide offices are a little bit different, but you can have a say in trying to exert pressure at different layers of different levels of government. So you have these interest groups, right? We know why there's so many. There's a lot of different interests out there, things that people care about, right? We have the freedom to do that, freedom to engage our government, freedom to get together and discuss different things. So why do people ultimately join interest groups? And there's a variety of different reasons. And people could have latent interests, right? And then there's not going to be an interest group for people that have latent interests. But that could potentially down the line turn into a interest group if that latent interest becomes popular for some reason. But when we talk about latent interest, and we'll compare those to the others, but it's public policy interests that aren't recognized or addressed by a group at a particular time, right? So it hasn't yet become a interest group, right, or a social movement, but it could have the potential. So when it comes to interest groups, it's really important to understand this idea of not only why people join interest groups, but why they don't. And so when we talk about why people don't join interest groups, what we're talking about is a free rider problem, right? We talk about getting a free ride, right? Getting something for nothing, right? So there are, in the public sector, right, there's a substantial free rider problem. In the private sector, not so much, right? Like, if you want to be part of this private group that goes out and, goes on all these wild, I don't know, whitewater rafting trips and all that kind of stuff. Well, you won't get a benefit of that from that group unless you join, you pay your dues and all that stuff. You have to be a member of that, right? And they don't let anybody who's not a member go on these trips and get all these advantages and all this kind of stuff, right? Well, that's different in the public sector because public policy, right, can't discriminate. We've talked about that, right? So when a particular interest group wants to push representatives to implement a public policy, it's going to affect everybody in that category, regardless of whether or not you're a member of that group or not. So if you can get the public policy benefit that that interest group is advocating for without having to pay to be a member or go to meetings and do all this work, then you get a benefit without effort and you're free riding. Okay, so let me give you an example. So when it comes to public policy, the AARP advocates for older Americans, right? You talk about 55 years of age and older. So the AARP advocates for a variety of different public policy. So when they're successful at supporting a policy or opposing a policy, right, their members get a benefit, right? They're successful in advocating a position, their members get a benefit, right? They're members that are 55 years of age and older. But it's not just their members, right? Because there can't be carve-outs in the public sector, you can't discriminate. So just because this group says, well, I have members and that's why I want you to support this, because we have a lot of members and it's really important to all of us. Well, if that carve-out is made, it's gonna apply to all individuals 55 years of age and older, not just the members of the AARP, right? Because you can't, in public policy, you can't constitutionally, lawfully discriminate in that way. So the AARP has a free rider problem, and that's just one example of many. But what happens is, so what does the AARP do about that? They try to work with all these different organizations to create additional benefits to try to pull people in and say, yeah, you get the benefit of this public policy, but yeah, but look at all this other stuff you get. You get, hey, this free stuff and maybe discounted this or discounted that, free this, to try to bring people in to become members, because they're trying to combat the free rider problem. Okay. Same thing, another good example is the NRA, right? So you get, if the NRA is successful and you support the positions of the NRA, but you're not a member, you get the benefit of what the NRA is doing without having to be a member. So the NRA does a lot of those same things, trying to overcome the free rider problem to encourage membership by coordinating with different organizations to be able to offer free things, discounted things, to try to lure people into becoming members of their organization. So why people join, we'll talk about more, but it's also important to remember why people don't join, right? Because if they can get a benefit without putting in work or effort or money, they will do that, right? So let's go back to why people do join, right? Solidarity benefits, right? So if you want to be around and you want to associate with others, and you want to be around people that think the way you do or share an interest of yours, particular interest or hobby, right? That's a reason people join, right? I want to be around like-minded people. I want to be around people that like the things I like, that believe the things I believe, right? So people do that, right? Solidarity, right? We want to be around people that, right, have our interests, that are like-minded. Right? There could be materials incentives, right? And this is how some organizations overcome that free rider problem. But even in the private sector, there's material incentives. You get involved, you support an organization, an interest group based on economic benefits or opportunities. Right? So you join and say, hey, what do I get out of this deal? If I become a member, I get this. So you join because of material incentives. Right? And then you have purposive and incentives, right? So you support or participate in the activities of a group based on agreement with the goals of the group. What's the purpose of the organization? What are you trying to accomplish? So if you have someone with strong interest in human rights, you might join Amnesty International, right? Because you want to accomplish a certain goal, right? That's what you're focusing, right? And these aren't mutually exclusive, right? There can be material benefits, right? There can be solidarity benefits, right? They can be all tied in, but just want to kind of lay out all the different reasons people join interest groups. Okay? All right, so the type of interest groups, right? Especially when we're looking at public policy, there's a variety of different groups and, what they do, what they're concerned about, right? We have the economic component, right? There's business interests, trade associations, chambers of commerce, large and small companies, corporations, right? Agricultural interest groups, right? These are all there's an economic component to all of these different groups, right? Labor, right? Labor unions, labor interests fall under that. There's an economic component, right? They have an economic interest in public policies that are passed, that public policy that's passed. So these all fall under the economic interest group, right? Then there's environmental groups, right? There's issues in the environment. It could be regional, it could be national, international, right? It could be pollution at a lake or, climate change. It could be small or large scale, micro, macro interest groups in the environmental group component. Right, and then there's public interest groups, right? Public interest, right? We're talking about interests of the overall community, the national good, rather than like a narrow interest of a particular group, right? So we're not talking about, right, this neighborhood doesn't want, I don't know, a new McDonald's to be built, right next to their subdivision. Okay, so, well, yeah, but what about the public? What about promoting economic opportunity, things like that? So that would be like the public interest, improving the economy and things. But then the particular group of maybe a homeowners association or a community or a neighborhood group that opposes it would be kind of the differences, right? Of kind of particular ized group, right? Focused interest group, and then versus a public interest group. NATOR organizations that focus on consumer rights, consumer interests tend to be, those are the public interest groups. What's in the interest of the public? And then there can be, there's just a variety of public interest groups, right? What can improve situation for the public at large, right? And some of these can be kind of flow in between, right? You could have, environmental groups and things like that kind of fall in line with some of these things. But so like I said, not mutually exclusive, but it's important to understand the different types of interest groups. Then there's single interest groups. We're probably very familiar with these types of groups, right? The NRA falls in there, right? Pro-choice groups, pro-life groups. These all fall within that single interest. People are, if that's their one issue, and groups form, that becomes like the main issue, and they don't get involved in other policies. They don't get involved in other issues. That's their issue. That's what they focus on full time, right? So we see that, right? Go back to the NRA, but it's a perfect example. They support candidates that support their positions. They support Republicans. They support Democrats. They support people that support their positions, right? They support more Republicans than Democrats, but there are Democrats out there that get support from the NRA based on their positions on the Second Amendment, right? And people talk about, well, and there's NRA members that get real mad. They say, well, yeah, but they're bad on the economy and they're bad on this, they're bad on this. And the NRA tells them, but they're on the Second Amendment, that they're good. We're good with them because on the Second Amendment, they're good. You can fight those battles with another interest group, but on the Second Amendment, we are good with them. I don't care the party, right? So that's how these single interest groups operate. That's how they focus. They focus their energy on that issue. And there's benefits to that as well, right? So if you have an interest group that kind of scattered over a variety of issues, right? Not only are you dividing your support, but the more issues you're advocating for, you could have internal strife within the organization, because there might be people that are good with these different public policy positions, but not so good with other ones, right? So you have this internal struggle. You don't have that with single interest groups, right? You don't have divided resources, divided focus, divided effort, right? It doesn't exist because everyone's focused on the same goal, right? And then of course, foreign governments are type of interest group as well. So what makes an interest group powerful? Membership, right? Why do groups want to grow membership? Because you can advocate based on your size. Look how many, right? Groups do that all the time. We have, oh yeah, Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so, member of Congress. We have, 5,000 members of our organization in your district alone, right? You need to work with us because this matters, right? Membership matters because what members can do, members can advocate, but just having strength in numbers can push, elected officials and candidates to pay attention because guess what? They want to win elections, right? That's the number one goal of elected officials and candidates. They want to win elections. So they're trying to garner as much support as they can. So if you can bring members to bear, right? If you can turn members into votes, that matters, right? Financial means is important too. What are you capable of doing? Can you put out commercials? Can you put out mailers? Can you support candidates with financial donation? That matters. But these things can be mutually exclusive, right? You don't have to have a lot of members and a lot of money both to be powerful, right? Big pharma, small, limited group of companies, right? Don't have a lot, they're not talking a lot, and don't really have members, right? You have corporations, companies that are, privately owned. They have a lot of money, but right, it's not like they have a ton of members to influence, and to kind of push their agenda, right? So you can have one or both. A lot of interest groups, they work to have both, right? Both membership and financial means, but it's not necessary to have. What else makes an interest group powerful? Leadership is important. How dynamic your leader is, how influential they are, the connections that they have, the influence that they can have, right? We talk about, years ago, Charlton Heston, right, with the NRA, Leonardo DiCaprio with the WWF, right? They bring their influence to bear, right, to get people to pay attention, to sway individuals that their positions are correct and persuade people to join an organization or to act, right? So leadership can be very important, right? A lot of organizations, work very hard to seek out people that not only maybe lead, but endorse the organization too, are willing to help promote the organization because they have influence, right? We talked about that with public opinion. Who are these, influence leaders? Who are these opinion leaders? And so for interest groups, these opinion leaders can come in the shape of organizational leaders. And then I already talked about this. Cohesiveness matters, right? If you can be cohesive and coherent in your public policy position, that's going to be more effective. The more issues you try to take on within your organization, it's going to make you less cohesive and divide yourself. Single issue organizations are able to stay focused and they don't divide their efforts or resources. And then committedness is very important as well. How committed are people to the cause? Is it something just a passing fad, or is this something they're in it for the long haul? They're going to work hard. They care about it. This means something to them. That matters. Right? All right. So what do interest groups do to be effective? Right. We talked about what can make them powerful. Okay, so let's say they have a bunch of members, they have resources, they're committed, they know what they're going after, they know the public policy they want to shape or they want to influence. How do they go about it? Right. So there's direct techniques, right? An interest group, when they interact directly with government officials to further their group's goals, right? There's direct techniques, right? This involves lobbying, right? Meeting with public officials, testifying before Congress, assisting legislators and staff, socializing with elected officials. So you're going directly to these individuals, getting face time, right? Maybe if you're not talking about public policy all the time, but you're just getting in front of them. You're becoming familiar with them. You're building a relationship so that you can, when you need to call on that individual, um, they'll take your call. But not only that, you want to be in front of that elected officials, because there could be a time where they call on you, say, hey, there's this bill somebody's promoting. I want to get your take on it, right? You're the experts, right? You might be an environmental group and you're the experts on, soil pollution. And I need to get, I'm a member of Congress and I can't know everything. So I'm not an expert on soil pollution. Hey, I know Joe over at this interest group. Maybe I can call them and get their position. So you become a policy expert by building that relationship with these elected officials. So the information flows both ways, a very dynamic relationship. Then there's the ratings game, right? We see this a lot, right? We see elected officials promote their good grades from organizations that they like, or they think their constituents will like. They support, they also, candidates do this a lot, elected officials do this a lot. They promote bad grades from organizations that they think their constituents would not like, right? So I know I always talk about the NRA. It's NRA does this. Was one of the organizations that do ratings games consistently, and there was a member of Congress that I know, right? He talks, I'm proud of my F rating from the NRA, right? So, and then there's other members of Congress that go in and say, hey, I got my A rating from the NRA. So usually they promote these when they're on the extreme, right? I got an F, I got an A, right? But that matters depending on how you can play it. But interest groups do that because it can be beneficial for their members, right? If you want to influence your members to vote a certain way, you say, look, hey, look, this guy's got, maybe in a primary election, this guy's got an A rating. This other guy that's challenging him, we're kind of looking, we think he's more like a C, right? Well, I'm going to vote for the guy with an A, right? So it can be very influential in pushing your members to vote a certain way. Interest groups build alliances, right? Just like, political parties, they get their members, they have to build alliances as well. Interest groups do the same thing. If they need to garner more support, there could be multiple environmental groups or multiple senior groups that come and say, hey, let's pool our resources. Let's bring all our membership to bear to really put a lot of influence and put a lot of pressure on these elected officials or the bureaucrats creating regulations. They can provide campaign assistance through contributions or campaign workers or endorsements as well. Endorsements can go a long way depending on the organization and whether it carries any sway. All right. Then you have your indirect techniques where you can generate public pressure. So you're not directly engaging with the member of Congress as an interest group, but you're going out of your way to maybe write press releases or do certain things, right? Ads on TV to generate this public pressure for different candidates or elected officials. So use public relations strategies to create favorable public opinion toward an interest group. This is climate control, right? So this kind of public relations strategy of creating a favorable public opinion toward an interest group. So you want to not only put pressure on a member of Congress or an elected representative, but you're also trying to put a positive spin on your interest group as well, right? So you're saying, look, we're a stand-up organization. We try to do this, and Congressman so-and-so opposes it, right? So there's a variety of indirect strategies to try to get the public on your side. You can use constituents as lobbyists, right? That kind of indirect, asking constituents to write letters and saying, saying, hey, please support this or please oppose this, right? So that you can see that's indirect use of the public or your members to influence public policy. And then there's some more unconventional forms of pressure, such as a boycott, which aren't as common, but there you go. So, yeah, I told you, right? Well, we're just a couple minutes before 8 o'clock. So I told you that was substantially shorter, that chapter. We hit the high points and pretty quickly here. So hopefully you get a better understanding of what political parties do and interest groups do, how they're similar, how they're different. That'll be important things to know for the exam on Tuesday. I want you to know that. And with that, I will open it up. Does anybody have any questions about the material we covered tonight, any material that we've covered previously, or the exam on Tuesday?
About the exam on Tuesday, it's gonna.
Yeah,
How many questions did you say it was gonna be?
it was roughly the same. It'll be, I haven't finished the test yet. It'll be in like the mid 60 range, 65 questions.
Oh,
roughly.
okay, gotcha. Similar to last time. Gotcha.
Yep, yep. All multiple choice. Any other questions? Great. Well, like I said, I'm glad we are able to get out early. Appreciate the short break so we can get through all the material. In between now, there's no quiz. There's no quiz on the next chapter because I want you to focus on the next chapters because I want you to focus on your second exam because we're moving through the course at a rapid pace here. So just focus on the exam, getting a good grade there. Like I said, the exam's going to be straightforward. I want to test what you know, not tricks. We're not going to get into, deep in the details of all this historical information. So hopefully between the quizzes and the first exam, you have a pretty good idea of what my tests are like. And just reach out if you have any questions between now and Tuesday. And of course, keep my cell phone number handy in case you have any technical issues on Tuesday. All right, and I will get this PowerPoint posted tomorrow so that you have that as well. But I will hang out. I'm going to stop recording now.